Our speaker tonight is Don Connor, and he's going to talk a little bit about equipment and give you kind of a heads up on what you need and whatnot. So Don, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So my name is Don Connor. I've been a volunteer with Idaho 2Fly since 2015, and I always volunteer at the Three Rivers Ranch event in October, and it is without a doubt my favorite fishing weekend of the entire year. It's a special place with special people and a special mission, and something I really do look forward to. So first of all, we are going to talk about equipment. I don't want to hear if you get in trouble for spending any money, because I'm not going to encourage you to spend any money. It's all on your own. But hopefully we can save you some money, or at least prevent you from having to buy things twice, or have a little more knowledge going into your purchases. So. Agenda up here, tried to keep it simple. If you have questions as we're going through, just stop me, because you'll probably forget what it is when we get to the end and have time for questions. And I'd like to leave time at the end, if we can get through this, if you do have any other questions about equipment or anything else that's happened during these classes. I'm sure between the collective group here we can come up with some good answers for you. I do want to start by saying we have 3 fantastic fly shops in town. Idaho Angler on the corner of Vista and Overland. Anglers, the Freeway in Overland, and then Three Rivers Ranch down in Eagle. They all have great staff that are very approachable. They're willing to answer any questions you have. If you want to go in and play with some fly rods, any of them will line one up, take you out in the parking lot, let you cast it around. You might get a free casting lesson out of it if you do that, depending on who you get, which could be really valuable. So, in the old days, fly shops kind of had this reputation for being a difficult place to go in as a beginner and ask questions. I think that's changed quite a bit with time. You've met quite a few of the fly shop employees through these classes. People like Tom Governale, who did the Stillwater class. Very knowledgeable, very approachable, and very willing to help you when you come into the shop, because they'd rather talk to you than have to ring stuff up in the register and count flies and do all of those other activities. So as a brief introduction, I will say good gear will not only last a lifetime and beyond, but it'll lessen the frustration that you may have when you're out on the stream. I was down at Pyramid Lake a couple of years ago. If you've seen the pictures of these 30-inch cutthroat trout that they catch standing on the ladders, I had to experience that. I went down. I was fishing a rod that was made in 1940. It's a 9-foot bamboo fly rod with a reel from the 50s, an old Pfluger medalist here, and caught a 29-inch cutthroat on that with no concerns. Good gear really will absolutely last a lifetime, and it does not have to be expensive. Inexpensive fly gear is getting better and better every year. You no longer have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get something that's really, really good equipment and will last you a long time. That said, you can't buy skills, and learning how to cast a fly rod really well will allow you to have more enjoyment on the water. Casting a fly rod is as enjoyable as the fishing part of it when you know how to do it well. So please consider taking a casting lesson any opportunity that you have to do that.
Do you do that, Don? Do you do lessons?
I do every couple of years. I like to go when I'm over in for the Ashton retreat. I go over a week early and do some fishing on my own. And I really like fishing in Yellowstone Park and on the Madison River. And in West Yellowstone, there's a fly shop called Blue Ribbon Flies, which is a very well-known shop, great staff. And there's a gentleman there named John Juracek, who's regarded as one of the finest casters, at least in the West.
Oh.
And you can get a lesson with him. You walk across the street from the fly shop to a little park, and get an hour lesson and just kind of fine tune some things. What I have found is the first 2 or 3 lessons that I had were spent undoing all of the bad habits that I had developed from trying to learn on my own. And if I had started with some good lessons, I really would have been way ahead in my casting game. You know, your own worst enemy. And you know, we all have well-meaning friends that'll take you out and get you casting, and that's great to get started. But getting a lesson from somebody who actually knows what they're doing is just a game changer. I don't know about the other shops in town, but I know that Idaho Angler, I think all of their guides and many of their shop employees are what's called FFI certified. So there's a international fly casting organization that has a very stringent casting instructor test, and you can get certified as a casting instructor. And the guys at Idaho Anglers, many of them are FFI certified casting instructors. So you're not just getting somebody who's a good caster but understands really casting theory, and you know, they're not just a good caster, they're a good instructor in casting, and that can make all the difference. So highly encourage you to do that. And then, you know, lastly, sometimes gasoline is a better investment than new gear. Use the gear what you have and spend time on the water. And then when you identify a need that you have, that's the time to go and get a new piece of gear. Whether you want to try something new technique-wise, like Euro nymphing, you know, which has slightly different equipment, or you just are really getting into small creeks and you want a short little brush rod. You know, those are niche pieces of equipment. But if you've got something that's serviceable, just go out and fish the heck out of it, and you know, that will be more fun than walking around a fly shop looking at new gear. I will also say, you know, there's the old saying that beauty magazines make you feel ugly and fitness magazines make you feel fat. The fly fishing industry exists to sell you stuff. And in order to do that, they have to convince you that the stuff you have isn't good and you need new stuff. And frankly, it's not true. The stuff you've got is probably just fine, and in many cases is better than the stuff they're trying to sell you, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So don't believe the hype. What you've got is probably just fine until it's not, and then you can find something new. We're going to go through these in order of importance. And of course, as always, this is my opinion. If you have a varying opinion, please speak up and we can have a conversation about it. But I'm going to say that fly lines and leaders are by far the most important piece in the trio of line, rod, and reel. And to understand that, we first need to kind of understand what is fly fishing? Why is it different than, you know, the spin fishing that you may have done growing up? And the difference is where the weight is. So if you grew up spin fishing, like most people did, you have a relatively weightless fly line, a monofilament, with a weighted lure, whether it's a spoon or a spinner or you know, just some big heavy chunk of lead that you're going to fling out there as far as you can and then reel in. Well, with fly fishing, it's reversed. The weight is represented by the fly line, and then the lure itself is relatively weightless most of the time. There are some, they call them flies, but they start looking an awful lot like lures at some point when you get into streamer fishing. But for the most part, relatively weightless fly, and then the weight is in the fly line. So you're not casting the lure, you're casting the fly line. So that's the important difference in the two. So fly line weight is a very objective thing. We know exactly where it comes from, and it's measured in grains. If you've ever been a shooter, you know, bullets are measured in grains, fly lines are measured in grains as well. And so they delineate 1 through, I think it goes up to 15, and there's actually some sub-zeros. But essentially, you know, each line weight corresponds to a number of grains. And that is for the first 30 feet of the fly line. That's how the industry has decided they're going to delineate these things. You weigh the first 30 feet of the fly line, that number in grains translates to a weight of fly rod. Fly rods 4, 5, and 6 are generally regarded as quote unquote trout rods and are the rods that would be appropriate for our area here. If you walk into any of the local fly shops and say, I just want an all around, you know, trout rod for this area, they're probably going to try to sell you a 5 weight because, you know, everything in life is a compromise and the 5 weight kind of sits in the middle. It does nothing well, but it does everything okay. You know, a 4 weight is going to give you more delicacy for really spooky trout or special conditions. A 6 weight is going to allow you to cast bigger flies or cast further distances because it has more mass. The line is heavier, you can throw it further. But the 5 weight sits in the middle and it's the good compromise. And if you're only going to own one rod, it's probably going to be a 5 weight. Although if you like bass fishing, I would probably recommend a 6 weight instead. It gives you a little more versatility. But 4, 5, and 6 is what we're looking at. And it's only 20 grains difference between those. So a little 22 long rifle bullet is about a 40 grain bullet. It's like half of a 22 bullet is the difference between a 4 and a 5 weight or a 5 and a 6 weight. But when it's out there with 30 feet of line and you have the momentum, that really translates to a big difference in feel, even though the actual physical difference isn't that great. Anything smaller than a 4 weight, they're kind of regarded as like East Coast fly rods. If you think about like the Smoky Mountains or the Appalachians, really small creeks, big rhododendrons choking in the water, short casts, not a lot of wind. They don't have a lot of utility out west, although, you know, a 3 weight can be a lot of fun. I'm not saying it never is an option, but it really limits your use. And then if you get into 7, 8, 9 weight, these are your steelhead, salmon, bonefish, which is a small saltwater fish, you know, more of a intermediate size. If you're going to go to Alaska, you're probably going to take an 8 or a 9 weight. And then when you get into 10 and above, you're talking usually saltwater, you know, big game fish.
So if I have a 5 weight rod, rated at 5 weight on the rod itself, do I buy a 5 weight line or do I upgrade to 5 plus or 6?
We're going to get there.
Okay.
We're going to get there. But the point of all of this is that fly line weight is objective. I can take a fly line that I know nothing about, I can peel off 30 feet, I can put it on my reloading scale, and if it weighs 140 grains plus or minus, I can look and say, that's a 5 weight line. Pretty easy. So fly line weight, we've just talked about. There's different types of lines, and Tom Governale touched on this a little bit in his Stillwater class. There's what's known as a floating line, and as you can imagine, the line floats. That's what most people use most of the time, is a floating line. Great for rivers, can be very useful in lakes as long as you're not trying to get too deep. It's just kind of the universal fly line. There are sink tip lines, which, as the name implies, the majority of the line is a floater, but the forward X number of feet is a sinking line, and it will have a different sinking rate. That varies from, you know, the first 5 feet to the first 30 feet, depending on the line. And I will tell you, I don't spend a lot of time with sinking lines. Tom Governale at Idaho Angler is your guy. He's really, really well versed in sinking lines. When I have questions, I ask Tom Governale. And then they also have full sink lines, which, again, as the name implies, they make it easy for us to understand these. The whole line sinks. And again, we're really talking, for the most part, still water, lakes and ponds when you're looking at sinking lines. There are some people that enjoy sinking lines on rivers with streamers. It's just not a technique that I do enough to really understand the benefit of having the sinking line with it. But if you have questions, again, Tom Governale at Idaho Angler. Lines will be designated as either WF or DT. And that stands for a weight forward or a double taper. And I've kind of represented them up here. So a weight forward line is going to have a front taper and a rear taper, and the front to the back is going to be 45, 50, 35 feet. Fairly short front taper. And the rest of that 90-foot fly line is what's called running line. It's thin, it has almost no weight. You can't cast it. It's just kind of trailing behind that weight forward. And the idea behind a weight forward line is that theoretically you can cast it further because you're throwing this short, heavy head, and then that thin running line is just going to sail through the guides and follow like a streamer behind that fly line. And you can debate the truth to that. A double taper has a front taper, gets thick, and then it stays thick for the entire 90 feet of the fly line, and then it tapers down at the back again. And they're kind of regarded as old-fashioned. I started fly fishing when I was about 8, and my first fly line was a double taper, and it's what everybody fished back then. Right now, I looked before I came here on the Orvis website, and for a 5-weight freshwater fly line, there were 15 lines available, 15 different types of lines. 14 of them were weight forwards, and 1 of them was a double taper. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute because I've got a different graphic. When your fly line is on your reel, there are different connecting loops. They usually look like this. Almost all fly lines come with a connecting loop now, so that you can do a loop-to-loop handshake knot with your leader and quickly swap them out. People like me cut the loops off and tie another type of knot. It's slimmer, it goes through the guides a little easier. And because I fish long leaders, when I bring a fish in to land it, those guides the connection is inside of those guides. And if you have that big connecting loop and they make a run on it, you can break the tip of the rod and it can get hung up in there. It's a personal preference. When you're starting out, leave the loop on. You don't have to learn as many knots. It's very easy. Down the road, you can decide for yourself whether that's a good way to connect for you or if you want to swap it out. If you buy usually a less expensive line that doesn't have that loop on it, it's not an issue. Just go to a fly shop. They'll tie on a piece of heavy butt material and then put a loop in the end of that, and you can loop to loop straight to that mono. It's just a modern convenience that comes on fly lines, but like most modern conveniences, some people can't live without them anymore. So if it's important to you.
Guy that taught the dry flying class, he said that he feels that the loop-to-loop spooks fish.
I would agree in the types of conditions that he's fishing in and the types of conditions I often fish in. If you think about it, that's a doubled over fly line at the closest to the fish that the fly line gets. It can cause some disturbance. And in some waters, that is very important. Other places, it doesn't matter. It's also a way for moss and other things to kind of get hung up on there because you have a lot of bulk in that one area. I do what's called a needle nail knot on all of mine, which means I actually poke a needle through the core of the fly line and then poke it out the side and then do a nail knot on there. It's about as slim as you can get, and it's just left on there as a permanent connection. I don't have to, I change them once a year just to make sure that it's not getting brittle. Again, it's personal preference, but some people really can't live without they kind of have a knot phobia, They're not averse, and they really like that. So if it's important to you, you want to make sure you have that.
Did you say they're not averse?
Not averse.
Oh, not.
Before your fly line goes on the reel, most shops are going to load it up with backing. The fly line is green, the backing is red. You can see it through those little ports here. One is orange, one is yellow. It's the white stuff. It's usually 20 pound or 30 pound. In the trout world, it's 20 pound. It's called Dacron backing. It's like kite string. It serves a couple of purposes. We all like to think that when you catch that huge fish and it takes your 90-foot fly line out, then you don't come to an abrupt end. You know, you've got all of this 100 yards of backing that it can take. In reality, that's not actually the way it works. It's rare to see your backing. If you do see your backing, it usually means you're not going to land that fish. It's got the best of you. Or when I see my backing, it's because I'm someplace like the Madison River in a drift boat, and I get hung up on a rock. And I haven't figured it out yet. And by the time I do, I'm in my backing. But what it does do is it helps bulk up the reel so that the fly line that's wound on there isn't wound so tight. These fly lines get some memory in them, and they can be coiled. So when you pull it out, it's going to come out in these coils. You have to stretch the line to get rid of them. The bigger the arbor is by building it up with fly backing, the less your line is going to get bound up.
So Don, should we buy large arbor reels?
We're going to get there.
Okay, sorry. Way ahead.
Good questions though.
Okay, all right.
Maintenance. Fly lines are getting more and more expensive. This is one place that I think buying a premium product is actually worth it. The more expensive fly lines have more advanced technology in the coatings that go on them, so they stay slicker, which means they cast further and easier, and they stay cleaner. It's worth splurging a little bit on a fly line. Because they're expensive, you want to take care of them and make sure they're going to last as long as you can. So what I do from a maintenance standpoint, I just run it through a wet paper cloth if I feel like it's getting dull in color or visibly dirty. There's a lot of YouTube videos you can watch on how to clean a fly line. 5-gallon bucket, little dishwashing soap. Keeping it clean, I don't completely understand this, but my understanding is the lotions and potions and coatings that they put on it to make it good are like impregnated into the line, and even a slightly abrasive material, it almost like releases that and allows it to recoat the line and make it slick again. But you can bring a line back to life that's feeling like it needs to be replaced just by giving it a good cleaning. Otherwise, inspect it for any cracks or nicks, especially around that loop at the end. Because it's doubled over and welded, it can hinge there and it can crack. And then water will soak into the core, the tip of your fly line will start leaking. What you can do is cut the loop off, do one of these needle nail knots, and then treat it with like a flexible super glue, or I use a UV resin on there to seal that up and put some life back into your fly line.
Texture line versus smooth line.
Yeah, I don't have one here. They have textured lines that have like little dimples, and the idea is that they're like a golf ball, and they're going to sit higher because of the
Slice.
right. I have fished some of the early ones. The first thing is they make a noise going through the guides, much like a silk fly line does. If you've ever fished a silk line, it has a has a noise that you have to get used to. I actually had some like skin abrasions from a fish taking off. You're trying to clear line, it'll actually cut you
Well,
from that abrasion. I don't think they're as aggressive now as they were early, and this was one of the early lines. Frankly, I don't see a lot of benefit to them, but I'm starting to fish more and more silk lines, so I don't have a need for the textured line. So I don't know.
Only I've heard too, they pick up easier, so only I've heard.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's.
I don't have a lot of problem picking up as it is, but
Okay.
you know, maybe I'm missing out on something. I don't know. I would have to try one. So, a case for the double taper line. I fish double taper lines whenever I can, and here's the reason. You have a leader tied onto the end of your fly line, which is usually around here 9 to 11 feet. And then you've got that first 30 feet of fly line. That first 30 feet is, for the most part, for a standard trout line, is identical in a weight forward and a double taper. For a weight forward, it then goes into running line. For a double taper, it just stays thick as it goes on. So we're looking at 30 feet of fly line. The two lines are identical. And then you've got this 9-foot rod that you've got stretched out. So if you cast that, basically, unless you cast beyond 48 feet, a weight forward and a double taper are casting exactly the same. It's the same taper, you've got the same ends on there. The thing that you can't do with a weight forward that you can do with a double taper is turn it around and have a brand new fly line. So a double taper fly line, you get 2 lines for the price of 1. And as they get more and more expensive, getting your lines for half price is kind of a nice prospect. Of course, fly shops will convince you that you're going to cast further with this weight forward for all these different reasons, because they get to sell you twice as many fly lines. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I don't catch fish beyond 48 feet. Like normally 15 to 25, is where I'm catching my fish. So if you want to try to cast the entire fly line, the entire 90 feet, and get it out there and really impress people, by all means buy a weight forward. If you want to get your fly lines for half price, buy a double taper. The only caveat is a double taper fly line takes up more space on the reel, because instead of getting thin, it stays thick. So I tend to fish my reels, I just go one size up. Instead of the 5/6 weight reel, I get the 6/7 weight reel, and it just gives me a little more room on there. So,
Question,
yes, sir.
is there a shelf life on fly lines?
There is not. Fly lines will last,
The
effectively
reason I ask is
forever.
I've got some old scientific angler line, it's gotta be 30 years old.
There's not a shelf life. However, there are things that can shorten the life of them. UV light, just like any other
Right.
plastic, will break it down quickly. I'm told ozone from like electric motors or furnaces can be detrimental to that.
Just stored on the reel.
Just store it on the reel. Your biggest issue is going to be it's probably going to be severely coiled. So just pull the fly line off of the reel and stretch it. So this is a one that I fish quite a bit, so it's not coiled up. When you do this, it's going to come off like an old telephone cord,
Oh, okay.
severely coiled. So just take it between your hands and stretch it as hard as you can. You're not going to break it. You're not going to damage it. If you do damage it, it was already damaged. You're just identifying it. Pull it out, and as long as it goes straight and it's not continued to be coiled, you should be able to fish it without issue.
Can you do that dry, or you gotta wet the line to do it?
Stretching it,
Yeah.
do it dry.
either.
Yeah, you can't hurt it. Yes, sir.
Am I seeing up there that the double taper is 48 feet typically?
This 48 feet is representative of 9 foot of leader, 9 foot of rod, and 30 feet of line.
Okay, so the double, how long is usually the double taper on the line?
90 feet.
Okay, so if you're casting a streamer and you're doing a double haul and you're getting out there 60, 70 feet, possibly, okay, does the double taper actually better at that point?
For me, yes. For others, no. So as you know, when you're fishing a weight forward line, you can't carry the running line in the air. You have to carry the head in the air and then shoot that running line.
Right.
I like to carry line in the air, and I can do that with a double taper. So I can carry 50 feet of line in the air rather than carrying that head. To me, and the way I cast, I don't shoot line, I cast line. Because I'm not fishing weight forwards and it's not my casting style. I'm using softer rods instead of the super fast, with the streamers. Maybe it's weighted. You'd have to try it.
Usually you use double haul when you're sending a streamer out there?
I don't fish a lot of streamers. I do a double haul. And in those bigger, like 7 and up, I will say I do fish weight forwards because it's hard to find double tapers for one. And usually I'm looking for a more aggressive front taper, and double tapers are all going to have the same front taper. If you want an aggressive front taper, you're going to have to go with the weight forward. And so what we're talking about is as fly rods have gotten more and more stiff, we'll talk more about this later. As they get stiffer and stiffer, you need more weight sooner to engage the line. And so they get these really hyper aggressive front tapers on weight forward lines. So if I'm looking for something like that, you're only going to get it in the weight forward. But for regular trout, dry fly, nymphine, I think a double taper is going to be better. Especially in nymphine, which you don't really think about, you can mend a lot more line with the double taper because you're not trying to mend that running line. You actually have some mass to try to lift up and flip. So if you're really, on a big river and getting really aggressive with that, a double taper is going to,
Like a roll cast?
or roll casting, a double taper will excel.
Do you think the industry is getting away from double tapers? Just seems like there's fewer and fewer of them.
If you go to the Orvis website, you'll find 14 weight forwards and 1 double taper. So the reason for buying a double taper, we've talked about many of them. The other is, especially if you're starting out, you're going to ruin your fly line by stepping on it. Because you're going to have this line out and you're not paying attention and you look down and your $80 fly line is in the sand and you're walking all over it. You can flip it over and you get a mulligan on that. So, there's something there. Some people used to actually physically cut the line in half, measure it out, cut it in half, tie it onto the backing and put it away. I don't have a problem just having both of them on there. Leaders and tippet. This isn't really, equipment per se, but there's been a lot of questions each week that people I don't really think had addressed, so I thought we'd address it here. So leaders and tippet. Leaders are the long piece of monofilament that connects your fly line to your fly. They come in knotless tapered leaders. You can make your own if you've got more time than money and do knotted leaders. Or they make things like furled leaders. Leaders are cheap. You should buy a few different ones, different types, and try them out and see what you like. It's a nice way to buy a new piece of gear for like $8 and, add some excitement into your fishing. Leaders start out thick at the butt section where it connects to your fly line and then progressively gets thinner, so down at the end it's small enough to tie your fly on. if you think about the makeup of it, we'll use a 10-foot leader as an example because it makes the math easier for me. It'll have kind of a 60% butt section, a 20% midsection, and then a 20% tippet. So for a 10-foot leader, you'll have 6 feet that's pretty thick, close to the thickness of the fly line. And then 2 feet of it is gonna go from that thick down to thin, and then you'll have another 2 feet that's just level, straight, thin. That level, straight, thin is your tippet. It's built into the leader. It's part of it. As you tie flies on, cut them off, put some split shot on and nick the line, that 2 feet is gonna get worked down and down and down, and if you didn't do anything about it, you would find you can't put your fly in anymore because you're in the midsection and that line is rapidly getting thicker. So you add on more tippet with tippet material. And that's these little spools in different sizes that we all carry with us. This is just monofilament of different diameters on here for different flies. So, we talked about the different sizes. Most people will buy a knotless tapered leader, which because most people nymph fish, it's optimized for nymph fishing. And so it stays really, the butt section hardly goes down in diameter at all. It stays very thick all the way down to the end because it needs to turn over a lot of mass of an indicator and a couple of split shot and some flies. So it wants to carry that energy further. A dry fly leader, you want it to be a more gradual decline in diameter, so it lays over with some delicacy, and that's where hand-tied leaders come in. If you're mostly nymph fishing, buy the knotless leaders, the knotless tapered, and they're fine. You can fish, if you're lucky, you can fish an entire summer with one of them. If you're really rough on it and slide your indicator and you're not very nice to it, you may have to change it every couple of trips. But again, they're cheap. It's an easy way to try out a new piece of equipment. When you go to the fly shop to buy one of these, there's going to be a wall full of them. And you're going to stand there and figure out what the hell you're supposed to buy. They're designated by the length and then an X size. Normally you'll see a 7.5 foot, a 9 foot, and then sometimes a 12 foot, although they're kind of difficult to find. The majority of them are going to be the 9-footers, and then there'll be 0X, 1X, 2X, 3X, all the way down to probably 8X. I wonder what the heck does that mean? The length is fairly obvious. That's how long they are. For general trout fishing in this area, I would recommend a 9-foot leader, although a lot of people like a 7.5 foot. I think Nate Brumley, who did the dry fly class, likes a 7.5 foot, and then he adds tippet onto that and ends up with probably, frankly, an 11-foot leader. Doesn't really matter how you get there. He just likes that really long tippet for the extra delicacy for the type of fishing he does. I only buy 9-foot 3X. The reason is I always know I have a 9-foot 3X. If you buy a 0X and a 5X and an 8X and you look at your line on your reel, you're going to say, what the heck is this? What I do is I buy a 9-foot 3X and I cut a foot of it off. And then I tie on 2 feet of tippet.
Which end do you cut on?
The skinny end.
Okay.
The skinny end. The reason is because I've got a 2-foot tippet there. And if I just add tippet material onto that, it's not going to give me the turnover I want. So I cut a foot back and often put on a tippet ring, which you may have seen. They're little like 2mm rings. It's like the eye of a hook without the hook. What it does is allow you to not have to tie knots on and whittle that thing back. You can just tie your tippet directly onto that, and it really makes your leader last like the entire summer.
Do you still use the 3X if you're going down to 5, 6, or 7X?
Yeah, so I get the 9-foot 3X, I cut a foot off, and then I tie on what I want. What that tells me is anytime I pull this out, the knot is 3X. And so if I want to go to a 6X, I'll tie on a short piece of 4X, a short piece of 5X, and then a long piece of 6X. But when I look at it, I know my first knot is 3X, so I never have to guess about that. Or the tippet ring is 3X. With the tippet ring, you can jump sizes. It's the different diameters going into a knot that isn't strong. So if I tie a tippet ring onto 3X, I can go straight to 7X.
Really?
In fact, I can go straight to a really long piece of
That
7X.
cast okay?
Cast's fine. I mean, obviously, the longer it is, the more difficult it'll be to turn it over.
Right.
But if you don't want it to completely turn over, then that, because it's just a clinch knot or a tri-lane knot or whatever your preferred knot is. So to simplify it, I buy a 9-foot 3X. I cut a foot off just to help the transition. Put on a tippet ring, and then you can put on whatever tippet you want.
What knot do you use to tie on a tip ring?
I would recommend a clinch knot. That's not what I use. I use what's called a Eugene bend knot, which is a stronger knot that's still very slim in profile, because I want the tippet to break off, not the tippet ring. So I want the tippet knot to be weaker so that I don't lose my tippet ring. So, but just a regular clinch knot will work. And as long as you're not going 3X to 3X, the tippet is always going to be weaker, just because it's smaller in diameter. So regular clinch knot is fine. Yes, sir.
At the Orvis store sold me a tip, and he said, you won't replace it for the whole season, and it had a ring already on the end of it.
Yeah. Was it a furled leader?
I don't know if it was, I think it was furled.
Was it thread like this?
It was thread, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the one I had thread, and one, I thought it was mono as well, but I think it was thread.
Yeah. Tippet rings came out of the competition, the Euro knitting competition stuff. And they have a lot of utility there, but they're really convenient, especially if it's getting towards dark, you can't see very well. You need to, the fish are hatching. You need to make this thing happen fast. It's just, most people can tie a clinch knot with their eyes closed because they've done a million of them, rather than trying to do cut off a section and do a triple surgeon's knot in a little bit of wind at night when fish are rising around you. And that offers a lot of convenience. They don't sink. I mean, they weigh nothing. It's like the eye of a hook.
And it's small enough where it doesn't spook.
Yeah, the trick is just thread it onto your line before you take it off that snap swivel, because you will never find it when you drop it. So, everyone understands the leaders, different types, size and length. When you go to buy tippet material, and a couple of folks have talked about this, the gentleman from Three Rivers Ranch and Tom Governale both talked about fluorocarbon and how they're sold on it. So when you go to buy these little spools, as they said, you'll identify the fluorocarbon one because it's going to cost 3 times as much. And then the other one is referred to as mono. Well, of course, they're both monofilament because they're single filaments. One is nylon, referred to as mono because it's been used forever. And then the newer material is fluorocarbon. It's harder, it's denser, it has a lot of characteristics that make it beneficial, but it's 3 times as much and it doesn't degrade. Like environmentally, it never goes away. Fishing line lasts a few years, but it eventually gets baked in the UV and it gets brittle, and fluorocarbon doesn't go away. So I have not seen that big of a difference. I use nylon. I don't use fluorocarbon, except I carry 3 through 7X material. In 6 and 7, I buy fluorocarbon because I don't use it as often. And the other stuff, after about 2 years, it loses strength and you get rid of it and replace it. Because I don't use 6 and 7X that often, I buy fluoro so that it lasts longer.
The only comment that Nate had made in his presentation is he doesn't use fluorocarbon at all, because in small dry flies, the fluorocarbon actually sinks.
It does, but in certain conditions, you might use it because of that.
Exactly.
Because it'll make it a little less invisible. Frankly, you know, we fret about how many tails a mayfly has or how many legs it has. They can see the fly. They can see the barb on the hook. You know, we're not fooling them to that extent, but they've still got to eat, and so they're going to make mistakes. I don't feel like the extra cost and the environmental, you know, detriment is worth going to fluorocarbon. So, and you know, I catch plenty of fish. Yes, sir.
I buy the bait casters fluorocarbon, the
Yeah.
bigger spools for a third of the price,
Yeah,
and it works fine.
yeah, I'm sure it does. Again, it's partly an environmental concern as much as a cost concern. And I don't think I fish as much as Tom Governale, but I fish a lot. I've not seen a difference. You know, if I've got a super spooky fish and I go from nylon to fluoro, that's not making the difference. Going from 6X to 7X and adding another 2 feet makes the difference, and I can do that with nylon. So X sizes confuse a lot of people because it's an antiquated system that doesn't make any sense. The X is how many times a silk gut leader was drawn through a mandrel to size it, because that's what they used before they had nylon monofilament. It was silk gut. So if you pulled it through the die one time, it came out around 11 thousandths of an inch. And if you pulled it through the next hole, it went down 1 thousandths, and so you pulled it down one time. Again, it makes absolutely zero sense, but we continue to use it because, you know, we just like to be antiquated that way. If you think about it though, everything's got to add up to 11. So 0x is 11 thousandths thick. 5x is 6 thousandths of an inch thick. 8x is 3 thousandths of an inch thick. 11x doesn't exist because it would be vapor. So the bigger the number, the smaller the size. Where this makes a difference is when you're tying your fly on. If you try to put a really thin monofilament onto a big fly, the knot won't hold. It's going to slip or break. It just doesn't work. So you need to size the tippet to the fly. There's kind of a rule of thumb. If you take the fly size and divide it by 3 or 4, that's the size tippet you need. So size 18 fly divided by 3, that's 6x. For me, that's a little small. I go up to 5x on a size 18, but again, it's a rule of thumb, and it'll kind of get you in the ballpark.
Does the tippet size have any bearing on what size of fly line you're using?
It does not, because your leader is going to be identical down to that tippet. The butt section is the same size whether it's a 8x or a 3x leader. The mid is the same. That tippet is the only thing that makes the difference. This can be confusing. Does anyone have any questions on this? Does this make sense? Okay. Leaders are probably the most confusing thing for new fly fishers because there's a lot of jargon that doesn't make sense. The numbers go the wrong way. And you think you need to buy a 7.5 foot 3X, a 7.5 foot 4X, a 7.5 foot, and then all the 9 footers, just pick one and build your own with your knots. So I use a 9 foot 3X, Jack uses a 7.5 foot 4X, and then you add on to that to get to probably a 9, 10, 12 foot leader at the end of the day.
Just to clarify, on the butt sections,
Mhm.
so is the butt section of a 6X the same as the butt section of a 3X?
It is. Where it will change is when you go to like the steelhead leaders.
Yeah.
It will be thick. So it depends on the brand. The butt section is usually anywhere between like 21 and 23 thousandths of an inch thick. If you go to like a steelhead leader, it'll normally be, I don't know, like 25 or 26 thousandths of an inch. I tie my own leaders. This is a hand-tied leader. You just get material of, 20 thousandths, 17 thousandths, 15 thousandths. There's formulas online, and you just tie them together with blood knots. I do that down to 3x, and then I put a tippet ring on it, and then I can put whatever tippet size I want on there. They take about 5 minutes to make. You can,
For you.
well, you can experiment with different tapers. It's kind of fun, and all it costs you is a big bag of different size material. So, all right, we're gonna go faster now, I promise. But that was the confusing
No, I was
part.
just gonna ask, do you ever fish 8X?
No,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Especially on the wires up.
7x is an act of desperation, where I've the trico hatch is almost over, and I'm just frustrated.
Yeah,
The problem is on 7x, when you set the hook, you break it off.
right.
So you have to very gently lift it and then gingerly get them in. I've never landed a fish on 7x.
Wow.
6x I do fine on. I can fish 6x all day long. 7x, it's just, man, that is so thin. All right, we're gonna move on. Anyone that's been to the Ashton Retreat probably recognizes that shoreline. It's the Warm River right up from the lodge. My lovely wife swinging soft tackles. All right, casting dynamics. So we've talked about fly lines representing mass. And when you start your back cast, the mass of the fly line loads the fly rod as you're pulling it back, and it stores that energy. When you stop at the end of your cast, it unloads that energy, casting the line back. You make connection, you start your forward cast, pulling against the mass, bends the rod, loads it with energy. When you stop on your forward cast, it casts the line forward. Sounds easy, right? So it's that stopping of the fly line that's important. You always see new fly fishers out there, whipping it around and going that, and they're not getting anywhere. It's the stop and then the connection that loads your fly line and gets it all going. So we talked about fly line weight. It's objective. I can measure 30 feet of fly line and know what weight that is. Fly rod weight is completely subjective. It's all based on what the manufacturer wants that rod to do. So, as an example, I do a static load test on my bamboo fly rods. I clamp it to a table. I put weight on it until it goes down 10% of the working length. I measure that weight in grams, and then I've got a chart. And between this amount of weight that it took to bend 10%, it's a 4 weight. It's this, it's a 5 weight, etc. I did that this is a 9-foot 5 weight Temple Forks rod. They run around $125, so it's a good entry-level price point. They've got a good warranty. It's a decent rod, nothing wrong with it. This is a 5 weight. When I put it on my deflection right before I came here, it's a really heavy 6 weight by my standard. If you put a 5 weight fly line on this, it's going to be a broomstick, very difficult to bend with the mass of the fly line. Which brings us to your question earlier. When I fish this, I fish it with a 6 weight line, and it's still pretty stiff and fast. I could probably fish it with a 7 weight, and it would be nice casting. But that's what they wanted. They wanted a stiff, fast rod for people that didn't know how to cast, so they can use muscle instead of finesse and just whip it around. So if we take this rod as an example, the manufacturer wanted a tip flex or a fast action. When I'm casting it with that 5 weight line that they recommend, it's only going to bend right up in the tip. It's going to be a really stiff, fast rod. If I fish it, I'm gonna put a 6-weight line on it. It's gonna be more mass, it's gonna bend deeper into the rod, and it's gonna give me a nice mid-flex action, which is kind of the, you know, the center point, the all-rounder fly rod. And then if you want a really, really deep flexing, slow action rod, I might put like an 8-weight line on that, which is not gonna be probably a lot of fun on something like that. But on a lighter weight one that's designed like that, where you can feel it bending down into the grip, you know, it's a lot of fun for a small, intimate creek where you're making short casts. So the rod is going to have a recommended line weight on it based on what the manufacturer was going for with that. Don't get stuck on that. There's nothing wrong with putting a 6-weight line on a 5-weight rod to make it bend a little deeper, to make it a little more enjoyable to cast. So
So there's a way of figuring it out without trial and error, spending $100 on the fly line?
So if you've got a rod already, take it to the fly shop. I do it because I build rods. So this is a 2-weight rod because I thought it was a fun taper and I wanted to experiment with it. I don't have a 2-weight line, and I'm probably not going to buy one because I have no use for it. So I'll go to Idaho Angler and say, hey Tom, can I borrow a 2-weight line? I want to test it on a rod. He'll pull out a 2-weight line. I'll take it out in the grass and I'll cast it. And I'll say, no, I think it's a 3-weight. Can I borrow a 3-weight line? And they'll give me a reel with a 3-weight and I'll go out and cast it. So if you've got a rod, and you're like, I don't love this rod, I think it could be better, take it in there and try a few different lines, or try, you know, a weight forward and a double taper, or a couple different brands of weight forwards that'll have different tapers. Find the one that you like. Or because these guys do it a lot, you can probably say, yeah, I've got a 9-foot 5-weight Temple Fork Outfitter Professional Series 2. And I'll be like, yeah, that one's pretty stiff. Use this line that's a half line heavy. Or it says it's a 5-weight, it's actually a 6-weight. Because they kind of get to know the brands. And then once you find that fly line that really makes it sing, buy 2 of them and, you know, stick them in the storage someplace. But again, fly line is objective, fly rods are completely subjective depending on what they want. So don't be afraid to experiment with it. I could put an 8-weight line on that rod and cast it. Not going to hurt the rod. It's not going to break it. It's completely fine. You know, you're not violating any laws with that. You rarely, that's called overlining a rod, where you say put a 6-weight line on a 5-weight rod. You rarely underline a rod. It's almost always overlining it. Usually there's not a benefit, unless somebody really got something wrong. Another reason you might want to use a heavier fly line is that when you are, so I'm the manufacturer of this rod. I built it. I take it out and I cast it. I'm going to cast it with 30 feet of line because that's the objective measurement for fly line. It's measured with 30 feet of line. And when I cast 30 feet of line with this, I'm going to say, and I know based off my static deflection, it's a 2-weight. But that's with 30 feet of fly line, 6 feet of fly rod, and probably 10 feet of leader. So I'm up to whatever, 40, 50 feet, say. I'm never going to cast this rod 50 feet. It's not what it's made for. It's made for casting, you know, right there with 9 feet of leader and maybe 3 feet of fly line. So I need the representative mass of 30 feet of 2-weight line in 5 feet of line. So I might put a 4-weight line on this because I'm never going to have more than that much fly line out. So I need that extra mass to bend the fly line to be able to do short little casts right off the tip of the rod. So that would be a good reason for overlining a rod, is because you're going to Wild Horse Creek and you're only going to have 10 feet of line out, not 30 feet of line out. So as you can see,
You switch Your lines often renew there, or you switch your rods?
Switch the reel.
Okay.
The reels have different lines on them.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can see this is that rod over there. You can see it's bending right down to the cork. This is a full flexing, slow action rod. The rod is a 5-weight. I put a 6-weight line on it for her because she's swinging soft hackles. She's not casting it. She's lifting it and then roll casting it out. Letting it swing, lifting it, roll casting. And by overlining it, it allows her to be able to feel it a little bit more and just be more enjoyable and relaxed. So I'll jump. Usually a rod will take, I'm going to say 3 different line weights, depending on distance, situation, size of flies. So don't be afraid to experiment. Just because it says it's a 5-weight doesn't mean you can only put a 5-weight line on it. All right, how not to choose a fly rod. I get to see a lot of people cast. They're interested in bamboo fly rods, which I know some of you are curious about. We can talk about it at the end. So I meet them down at the park. I bring an armful of rods and say, here you go, cast them, see what you think. So somebody will come to me and say, I really want a 6-foot 2-weight rod. Really, really intimate little spring creek for small fish at close distance. That's what I want. So I hand them this. The first thing they do is peel out about 40 feet of fly line and see how far they can cast it. That's not what it was made for, and that's not what their intended purpose is. But they just really want to see how much line they can cast with it. That's not how you pick a fly rod. You're going to end up with the wrong one. You're going to end up with a rod that's too stiff for your intended purpose. How you do choose a fly rod is you go to a fly shop where they have a bunch of fly rods. You tell them what your budget is and what you want to do with it, and you're going to get the sweet spot in the Venn diagram. And they're going to say, these are the rods under $300 that are good general purpose 5-weights for this area. And take them outside and cast them. And if you're really bad at casting, they're going to take pity on you and say, let me show you something. On your back cast, you need to stop so that the line can unfurl and do its thing. You'll get a free casting lesson out of it. Because watching somebody cast poorly is like watching a toddler eat spaghetti. Like you just got to get in there and do something. Cast it in the way that you intended. Don't try to cast a 2-weight fly rod 100 feet. So fly rods, try before you buy. The only way you're going to know if you like a fly rod is you've got to take it out and cast it. It's probably going to be on the grass, which is the closest you can get. It's going to be pretty close to what it's going to be on the water. Get it out, cast it with different fly lines. If it feels a little stiff with a 5-weight, ask them to put a 6-weight on it. Experiment with it and see what you want. The 3 materials that are widely available in fly rods: bamboo, fiberglass, and graphite. None of them are better than the other. They're just different, and they attract different people. I fish bamboo because I make bamboo. I like when I'm in a beautiful place, in beautiful surroundings, fishing for beautiful fish. I like to have a beautiful rod in my hand rather than a godless piece of black graphite. I want to smell the varnish when I pull it out of the
That's how I
tube.
really feel.
So it attracts me. Fiberglass is usually a little nostalgic for folks. Maybe you started fly fishing in the 70s and you want to go back to that old fiberglass feel. There's generally 2 types of fiberglass fly rods out there. The kind of nostalgic buggy whip, really just floppy fiberglass rods that can be fun for different conditions, but it's not your all-around rod. Or what's called modern glass, which is every bit as good as graphite. It can be very, very fast in action, very nice casting rods. You'll know which is which. Fiberglass is unique in that it usually comes in some neon obnoxious color like Smurf blue. or you know, pink. So if you want something funky out there, you might want to look at fiberglass. And then of course graphite is the overwhelming majority of what fly rods are being made out of. Line weight, I think we've beat that horse to
Question
death.
on, are bamboo rods, I hear of split bamboo, are they all split?
Yes.
Okay.
So when you make a bamboo fly rod, you start out with a 12-foot piece of bamboo that's that diameter.
Wow.
So you have to split it because you can't cast this for very long. So you take the 12 feet, cut it down to length, you taper it into little triangles. You glue 6 of those triangles together into a hexagon, and you end up with a hexagonal bamboo fly
So they're
rod.
always hexagonal, not round?
They're not. They are mostly hexagonal. There are 4-sided, 5-sided, 6-sided, 8-sided, and there's a guy I know in Italy that's making triangular rods that are technically 6-sided, but it's a really thin on the corners and then thick on the flats. So it's
Does it make a difference?
it does, but you've got to kind of be a real nerd
really good at
to
it.
realize it. Yeah. Talked about line weight, length, they come in different lengths. If you're fishing really small, intimate, choked in water, you might want a little 6-foot rod. If you're just generally fishing the Boise in town, you know, regular water, you want something between, you know, probably 8.5 or 9 feet. 9 feet being the most common. If you're gonna do a lot of Euro nymphing or just a lot of nymph fishing, where you wanna hold a lot of line off the water, you might like a 10 or 11-foot rod. If you're just starting out, get a 9-foot 5-weight and fish it until you find an opportunity for something different. New fly rods are great, you know, the short ones are fun, the long ones are fun, but for the most part, you're gonna be fishing that 8.5 or 9-foot 5-weight. So invest your money there in getting a good one, and then, you know, play around with the others. We talked about the action, slow, moderate, fast, and how you can adjust the action of a rod by adding or subtracting weight represented by the mass of the fly line. Number of pieces. So in the old days, a 1-piece rod was like nirvana. A 2-piece rod is what you did because nobody can deal with a 1-piece rod. And the reason is the ferrules, the connections. It's a dead spot in the taper. You know, it can't bend. And so the more ferrules you have, the more interruption in the taper and the more clunky it feels. That's not really a big issue anymore. They've gotten so good with the engineering that this 4-foot rod cast next to an identical one that's only 2 pieces, like you'd have to try really hard to feel the difference. It's just not that big of a deal anymore. And the 4-piece rod is a heck of a lot easier to travel with, especially if you fly somewhere. So it's hard to find a rod that's not a 4-piece rod. I really like 2-piece rods. I like 3-piece rods. But the bottom line is they're all good, and frankly, you're probably not going to have a choice. It's going to be whatever it is. So, but if you do travel a lot by plane, obviously the shorter the better. Warranties have become a big thing with fly rods because the industry has kind of put themselves over a barrel. Most fly rod companies have these incredible unconditional warranties now. There's a couple of reasons for it. One, fly rods have gotten progressively more expensive. And if you're spending several $100s on your rod and then it breaks, you're gonna be pretty mad. So in order to maintain relations, they needed an exceptional warranty. The other is, as much as everyone cringes with the bamboo and thinks it's delicate, it's not. I could roll my truck over the bamboo rod and then go out and fish it. It's going to be fine. It's solid wood. It's fine. Graphite is by far the most delicate out of all of the materials. Fiberglass is pretty tough. It's got thick walls, Especially if it's a weave, it's multi-directional. Fiberglass is tough. They use it for saltwater rods. Graphite is delicate. And people often think, oh, I was just fishing with it and I caught this monster 12-inch fish, broke my rod. The 12-inch fish didn't break your rod. What happens is you'll see the guys, you're over on the Waihi, you just fished this hole, you want to move upriver, you don't want to take the time to break down your stuff. So you stick it under the windshield wiper and you just drive, 100 yards up. Well, at the top of your windshield, this little fine tip is vibrating and rubbing against the ridge of that metal. And you're not going to notice it. It might be just the tiniest little scuff. But those micro abrasions are going to break. Not that day, like 2 trips from now. You're going to catch a 12-inch fish, or you're going to catch your fly in a tree and try to pull it out. Pull your $2 fly out of with a $300 fly rod, like we all do. That's when it's going to break. Graphite has incredibly thin walls and it is very brittle. So they had to warranty them to do that. What that means is when you buy a rod, you're probably buying 2 rods because you've got to cover the warranty when you're going to send this in. When you break it, they're causing fly rods to get more and more expensive in order to cover the warranties. So don't close your fly rod in the back of your truck, that's how these things break. They break by wrenching on it, trying to pull your fly out of the tree. They break with the automatic window. They break because you let your dog chew on it when you're not looking. Fly rods are actually pretty tough if you take care of them. The fact that it's an unconditional warranty means people don't take care of them. They throw them in the back of the truck. They let it ride under the windshield wiper because they don't care. Because if it breaks, they can just send it in and get a new one. I would rather see somebody buy a used rod for half the price and take care of it than spend twice the amount and abuse it knowing that it's warranted.
Those magnetic rod holders that go on your hood
Yeah.
and then up over the cab, as long as you're not doing 80 miles an hour.
Yeah, those are mostly, go 80, doesn't matter, they're padded.
Right.
There's no abrasion on there.
Okay.
I don't have an issue with that.
How about the storage rod holders that people put their rods in full length and leave them in there?
Yeah, no comment. I don't have one. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, break down your rod. It takes 5 minutes when you get there to tie a new fly on. Break down your rod, take care of your gear, and don't worry about the warranty. Fly reels. The discussion on fly reels got a whole lot shorter because fly rod reels have gotten a whole lot better. Unless you're buying something on, like Amazon that's probably in a brown trout print and it costs $20, it's hard to buy a bad fly reel. If you're buying something in a fly shop, like a reputable brand, buy what you want based on budget and what color it is. You can't buy a bad fly reel these days. You just really can't. For sake of education, you've got different arbor sizes. That's just the size of the central hub. You've got a small traditional one that you've got to build up with a bunch of backing. Then they went to mid-arbor, and now everything are these monstrous large arbor. They're really wide, really large arbor, so your line doesn't get wound up in there. They pick up line really fast. They're great. But buy what you want because they're all good. You're not going to get a bad one. You'll see materials, bar stock. Bar stock just means they start with a hockey puck of aluminum and cut away everything that's not a fly reel. It's one piece of aluminum that's milled. A cast reel like this one, they pour the aluminum in a mold and then they clean up, all the stuff afterwards. In the old days, the cast had a reputation for being brittle and not as good. I just don't think that's the case anymore. I buy cast reels, I have no problem, you know, eventually you're gonna drop it on the concrete in the parking lot. Like, they're tough, and they're getting cheaper. This is made by Lamson, which is a local company. They're off South Cole. Whether you buy their most expensive reel or their cheapest reel, you get the exact same drag system. It's a sealed drag. It's a steal. You get, I think, a reel with 2 spare spools for something like, I don't know, $150 or something. And they're good reels. If you've got a problem with it, they're right in town. They've got a great warranty.
Come two spools with it, or two
I think-
spares?
You'll have to look in the Cabela's magazine. I don't know.
Come to the Derby, you can win a rod and reel.
There you go.
Question.
Left-hand wind and right-hand wind. Back in the like 50s and 60s, all fly reels were right-hand wind because, you know, they all went to Catholic school and got rulered by nuns, and they forced you to reel with the hand you didn't want to. If you're fishing with a reel that's been made in the last, 50 years, you can swap it from left to right, retrieve. I absolutely cannot reel with my right hand. So I see these beautiful old Hardy reels, and I can't buy them because they're right hand wind. The new ones you can swap. Capacity and backing, I think we already talked about that. If you buy a double taper, you might use less backing or a bigger fly reel, but it'll tell you on the box. You'll buy it, it'll say WF5 plus 100, which means it'll take a weight forward 5 weight line plus 100 pounds of 20-pound backing. And then spare spools. You can buy spare spools, so you can have different lines and just pop it off, pop the new one on, and you're good to go. There's a false economy when you start getting to probably 3 spare spools. At that point, buy another reel, because at some point something will go wrong with the reel. They'll want to warranty it with a different type of reel, and you're left with all these spools that no longer fit anything. So rather than buying one really expensive reel, buy 2 identical cheap ones and a couple of spare spools. So you can have a floating line and a sinking line, or a 5 weight and a 6 weight and a 7 weight, and you're going to use them eventually.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Back when I was a little kid, they had a reel called an automatic reel.
Yeah.
Are those as bad as I hear?
Yeah, so you'll find them at yard sales all the time for $1.
And are they worth it?
And it'll have a lever on it, and as you pull line out, it coils a spring, and then when you pull that thing, it's going to go zzz and start winding it back on until it knots up at your tip top, and it's not going to stop, and it's going to break your rod as you're pulling that lever. So if you ever, I buy them at yard sales just to throw them away so that nobody will ever use them. Speaking of, this is made by a company called Pfluger. It's a Pfluger Medalist. I think they started making them up to like the A's. They're bulletproof. They're a little heavy, but like there's a million of them out there. There's 1.5 million of them out there. I buy these at yard sales for $5 or $10. One, oftentimes they have a good line on them. Probably not a floating line because it's maybe not been treated well, but if you get a bad sinking line, it's just going to sink, which is what you want a sinking line to do anyway. So I'm not afraid to get a used sinking line. So I'll buy these for like $5. One, they're good reels and I use them all the time. 2, especially if I'm in a float tube, I use one of these instead of an expensive reel, because if it falls off and I lose it, I'm out $5 and I'll buy another one at the next yard sale. So there's nothing wrong with them. They're great reels. They're bulletproof.
Don,
Yes, sir.
is there something said about the balance of a fly rod and the reel together? If you're casting all day,
Yeah, so there is when you're trying to balance it like this, some people will say there's a sweet spot.
right?
When you peel out 30 feet of line and then start doing this, where's the balance? Where are you balancing it? I do like a heavier reel because I'm using heavier rods, and I like a little pendulum, effect of it. I find that it works for me. Other people want the lightest reel that they can get. To answer your question, I don't think there's anything to the balance of it. It's a kinetic system. It's constantly moving. The weight is constantly changing based on the amount of fly line you have out. It's a dynamic system. A central balance point is meaningless. So buy the reel you want, whether it's because it looks like a brown trout or is gray instead of black. They're all good. You cannot buy a bad one. Doug had a question. Questions about fly reels? Yes, sir.
You can have any reel as long as it's a hatch.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of hatches.
Hey, bad.
Wonderful reels. Reels have become kind of a boutique thing, like rods. There's some absolutely fabulous reels being made. Small batch, beautiful artwork on them. They're lovely, and they're like $800 or $900. Or I can get a cheap one that when I drop it in the parking lot and it gets a big chunk out of it, I'm not gonna cry. Speaking of, I bought one of the really nice Lamsons a number of years ago. Much lighter than this, milled out of the bar stock instead of cast. Beautiful reel. And I, dropped it in the parking lot. And then when I picked it up and started reeling, it went crank, crank, crank. It bent. And I had to bend it. It's too thin. It's too light. We've gone beyond where we need to. I'd much rather have a clunky thing that I can drop and not worry about than the beautiful, light, latest and greatest aerodynamic thing. Doug's not back. All right, last piece, safety gear. Polarized glasses so you can see the fish and protect your eyes. John Walters has this absolutely gross picture of a fly in somebody's eye. I will not subject you to that, but especially if it's a little windy out or if there's somebody that you're fishing with next to you, please wear some type of glasses. In the bag that I take with me, I have a pair of cheap yellow, like shooting glasses. So if it's a little too dark in the morning or at night, I'll take off my polarized and I still have something to put on to protect my eyes. Please wear glasses of some type. Sun protection, obviously. I wear a big, broad-brimmed hat and long sleeves. A lot of people like the sun gloves. Unfortunately, I can't wear gloves of any type, no matter how hot or cold. But some people swear by them, especially if you have a fair complexion. Wading belt. If you buy waders, it'll come with a belt. And when, not if, but when you fall in the water, it'll prevent water from coming in too fast or too voluminous. It's still going to come in, but hopefully you can stand up before it gets down into your legs and weighs you down. Or if you fall in a deep pool, it won't fill up and sink you as quickly. Water is still coming in, believe me, and it's cold, and it will wake you up. The wader belt does help, and then you get to see people do really fun aerobatic things, trying to empty that water out on the shore, especially in the winter. But absolutely tight wading belt if you're in moving water. Wading boots come in either rubber sole, usually just a Vibram sole, or felt soles. Felt soles are kind of traditional. They're wonderful. They're really grippy on rocks, but they're becoming outlawed in certain places like Yellowstone Park, Alaska, someplace like Nebraska for who knows why, because they can harbor invasive species, little microscopic snails and things, and you get out of one watershed, you go to another, you can transfer those things. So they're becoming kind of outdated. I still have a pair. I use them on the Madison River because it is like greased bowling balls. It is incredibly slick. and I find the felt to be a little more comforting. They're horrible in the snow because you get an inch taller every time you step. So more and more, and if I was recommending to anybody, I would say get rubber soles, but then put some type of stud in them. You can use old sheet metal screws, you can get little carbide, expensive ones from the manufacturer. I like these bars. I bought some aluminum bar off of Amazon and, you know, did some threaded screw inserts and just made my own. You can buy an aftermarket kit from like Patagonia and just do your own with these boot bars. I find them incredibly stable, especially on basalt, like on the South Fork of the Boise. Something about that soft aluminum, it really bites in, and I feel very secure in them. Some people get away with just rubber, but you know, you're going to fall at some point. Yes, sir.
You said Yellowstone National Park? Felt?
No felt. For just pre-COVID, it started, so like 19.
Okay, I hadn't heard that, so.
Yeah, you can rent.
Go buy more boots.
You can rent boots, I think at Blue Ribbon, if you're just going into the park for the day and you don't want to buy new ones, but it's coming. Just find some rubber ones on sale. Local fly shops are awesome, good staff, good advice. There's also places like Sierra Trading Post. You know, fly fishing stuff is kind of like high fashion. Last year's model is out, this year's model is in, and you can get stuff for, you know, 20 or 30% cheaper if you're willing to wear last year's model that has gray laces instead of black laces. You know, it's kind of ridiculous. So you can get good wading boots for, you know, $100, $150. That'll be just fine. Wading staff. I make absolutely gorgeous bamboo wading staffs. If you'd like to buy one, talk to me later. I use the kind that fold and go into a pouch because I don't like to use it all the time. I only pull it out when I'm navel deep in the river, about to fall over, and I whip it out and it self-assembles, and I lock myself in on a rock. It's just more convenient than having something drag around you. They're incredibly light. Yeah, they're aluminum. You can beat the crap out of them. And if you buy the good ones, like the full staff, you could pretty much run over it with your car, send it back to the factory, they'll rebuild it and send it back to you.
Will they float away?
They do float, and they're on a lanyard. And it's always fun, you'll be standing there like, what the hell is that? It's your wading staff. And bear spray, especially if you're over in bear country or cougar country, or downtown and there's some sketchy looking characters hanging out under the bridge. You know, they work on pretty much anything four-legged or two-legged. It's discreet, it's right there. I always fish with it pretty much no matter where I'm at.
One thing that I started doing, Nick Brumley told me about it, but when you're fishing in cold weather, if you have some wool wading underneath your waders, if you're in really cold weather, you're not gonna freeze to death because it's actually almost like a wetsuit. Have you ever tried that?
If it gets wet,
Here's what I'm gonna say to that is, I experienced that. Cause I was on the South Fork in late November, 40 degrees in the afternoon, and I fell in and it got water down to my toes. But I just go, well, let's see how this works. So I just kept fishing, and less than 10 minutes later, it was no problem.
Yeah, you know, I grew up backpacking, and it was always the search for the next great thing, and oh, this Capeline is wonderful, and now you've got to have the down. There's so much good stuff out there, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper.
Well, I use some merino wool on that.
I use the merino wool.
Yeah.
So I wear merino wool, long underwear,
Yeah.
fleece pants,
Mm-hmm.
and then a pair of really thin, like quick dry wading pants. So when I get into the store on my way to the South Fork in the winter, I don't look like a dork walking around with sandals with socks and fleece pants. At least I'm wearing something with pockets.
Nice pair that look like real pants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I fish when it's pretty cold.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people you would see out in the old days with the neoprene waders, like the human condom that they'd have to roll on, thinking that was going to keep them warm. The Gore-Tex regular waders will keep you far warmer than any any of the neoprene out there. They're just
Layer up,
good.
yeah.
Yeah, they breathe, you don't get clammy in there, they're great. So that's the end of my presentation. I apologize I went a little late. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions should you have them.